Welcome to this week's Chalmers AI Talks. Today we have a talk by Arthur Gretton, who is a professor at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit and the director of the Center for Computational Statistics and Machine Learning at University College London. Additionally, he's a unit director for the Ellis Center at UCL, Ellis being the European Laboratory for Learning and Intelligent Systems. Arthur has made contributions to many areas in machine learning, and I've personally had the fortune to use some of the results of that work in my own research. And his research interests include topics like hypothesis testing and generative modeling. And I think we'll hear about both of them in today's talk. In particular, he has contributed to work on kernel-based measures of distributional distance, and you might have heard of something called the Maximum Mean Discrepancy, which has had a huge impact on machine learning, both in terms of theoretical work, but also in practice. This line of work has been awarded also with Best Paper Awards of NeurIPS, for example. I look up to Arthur, and not only because of his research and the elegance and fundamental nature of it, but also for his ability to present this work to a wider audience. He's a really good speaker, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. So without further ado, please take it away, Arthur.
All right. Oh, thank you for the kind introduction. Of course, now the pressure is on me to be very clear in my talk, so I'll do my best. So yeah, the talk today is on the generative model side of my work, so GANs with integral probability metrics. The talk, I'm going to try and aim at sort of presenting ideas and even speculation. So this is a little bit my thoughts about how IPMs, integral probability metrics, can be used in training generative models. Some of this is a little bit in advance of the theory. So I've got some notions of what's going on, but we don't yet have theory to back that up. But I think this is sort of interesting to think about. And so that will be my emphasis. The work today is work done with the people who I've photographed on the slide. So Michael Arbel, Nikolai Binkowski, and Dougal Sutherland. And this is work that they've done with me at Gatsby. All right. So at a high level, the idea that I'm going to be talking about today is the idea of comparing sets of objects, okay? So on this slide, I've got a distribution P, which is generating a set of objects, a distribution Q that is generating a set of objects. Here, P is a dog generating distribution, and Q is a fish generating distribution. And on the basis of these two sets, I want to compare the distributions P and Q. So in some sense, I want to know if P and Q are close based on the data that P and Q generate. So that's the very high level theme of the talk that I'll be giving today. Now, of course, this is an abstract idea. What would I be doing with something that compares two sets of objects or compares distributions based on two sets of objects? Well, to make things concrete, I'm going to be using this to train a generative model today. So let's say, for example, that I have a set of bedrooms. So this is on the left of this photo. And this is from some distribution P that generates all of the bedrooms that might exist. And let's say that I have a neural network, and my neural network, I wish to train it to generate images of bedrooms, all right? Then having a measure of similarity between two sets of objects would allow me to know when it is that my neural network is generating bedrooms that match my target distribution of bedrooms. Now, this task is a little bit harder than the task of just learning to draw a single picture of a bedroom. So one shortcut that my neural network might want to take is to say, well, I can draw one bedroom really well, and then I'm done. That's not satisfactory here. What I want is for my neural network to learn to draw pictures of all of the bedrooms that might exist rather than a single bedroom. And so this is my task. So this notion of training a neural network to generate sets of objects that match a target distribution, this is a very current topic in machine learning. And one of the very popular methods to do this are the generative adversarial networks, or GANs. Okay, so in particular, when I have my distance between distributions, my distance between, let's say, my set of real and fake bedrooms, I want to use this distance to train a GAN. I want to use that as a feedback so that my adversarial network learns to draw better pictures of bedrooms. So what is an application of this? So GANs, I think, have been enormously popular in the computer vision literature. They can be used for in-painting. They can be used to generate examples so as to augment training data sets. I also have a rather fun application of a GAN, which is in generating a fake painting, which can then be sold for perhaps more money than it should have been sold for. But GANs, I think now have a lot more serious applications in this. Yeah. Okay, so just a quick visual recap of what it is that a GAN is doing. And I'm doing this also to sort of give a visual cue, which I'll be using throughout the talk. So the GAN, it starts with a neural network, which is this little student here, a little beginning artist. And this neural network is going to generate a set of objects. Okay, so it could be a set of fake bedrooms. In this case, I'm going to show here a set of fake dogs. All right. So this is part of my GAN, the student part. And then I have here a critic, a teacher, that is going to take this set of fake dogs, a set of real dogs, and is going to provide feedback to the student, telling how far apart these sets are. So this is getting back to this notion of comparing sets of objects, okay? And then in a GAN, it's an adversarial thing, so this procedure iterates. So the student will take the feedback, it will improve its pictures of dogs, the critic will give feedback to the student, and this will continue until some sort of equilibrium is reached. Okay, and so this is a generative adversarial network. In this talk, I'm going to be focused on the critic here, on this teacher. So the student, this is the only slide that will address what the student does. The student takes some low-dimensional source of randomness, some noise, pushes it through a few layers of convolutional, or a few convolutional layers, and outputs an image. Okay, this is not something that I will be addressing in this talk further. So just assume that my student is given. I will be addressing pretty much entirely the teacher here. And the teacher's goal of comparing sets of images or sets of objects, perhaps real and fake dogs, perhaps real and fake bedrooms, and so on. All right, so this is my setting. So now just to give you an outline of what I'll talk about, the first thing I'm going to talk about, as indicated by Frederick, is the maximum mean discrepancy. So this is a measure of distance between sets of objects. It's going to be something called an integral probability metric. If you haven't heard of this, I'll be describing this in quite some detail. So by the end of the talk, you'll know exactly what I mean by that. So when GANs were first introduced, they were not trained using integral probability metrics. They were trained using f-divergences or phi-divergences. I will also talk a little bit about those, and I'll talk about how these might be used to train adversarial networks. And how they're similar to or how they're different from integral probability metrics. And then finally, having introduced this notion of distance between sets of objects, I'm going to go back to the GAN problem and say how we can use this distance between sets of objects to train a GAN. And this is where we're going to get into a little bit more of the sort of, shall we say, experimental or speculative side of this talk. Where I'll talk a little bit about how I think that these are being used to train GANs. And then right at the end, I'll talk a little bit about how we can evaluate GAN performance and look at some experiments. But very briefly on that, because I think it's more interesting to think about the what GANs are doing than to show tables of numbers. All right, so let's start with the maximum mean discrepancy, which is, as I've said, an integral probability metric. Now, the way to think about integral probability metrics, I think, is best shown in the following slides, which give a sort of thought experiment. So let's say that I've got P and Q. P and Q generate sets of points, and my question is, are P and Q similar, are P and Q different? So on this slide here, P and Q just generate points in a single dimension along the x-axis. I've got my blue points from P, I've got my red points from Q. And if I ask you based on this figure, if P and Q are different, you'd say, well, probably yes. But if I ask you based on these points, whether P and Q are different, you would say, well, on the evidence that you've shown me, I don't see a significant difference between P and Q. So I want some notion of difference between the sets of objects, between the sets of blue points and the set of red points that show me that these points are in some sense further apart than these points. Integral probability metrics are one way to do that. So what do? They look for a well-behaved function in some sense that maximizes the difference in means under P and Q. Okay, so I've got this well-behaved function f, and I want to choose this function from some set of well-behaved functions such that I maximize the difference in expectations under P and Q of f. So you can see, because it's in 1D, what this function looked like. It's a function that has a large positive amplitude on the blue points. It has a large negative amplitude on the red points. When I take the expectation under P of f minus expectation under Q of f, I'm going to get a big number here. What about for this set of points here? Well, because I've got a well-behaved f, so in this case, well-behaved actually means smooth, I'm not able to make my function as positive on my blue points or as negative on my red points as I was here when the red and blue was sort of more distinct. And so in this case, my red and my blue are closer together. My well-behaved function is not able to diverge from 0 as far. And so my EP of f minus EQ of f tells me that my red and my blue points are closer together here than they were here. So this is the notion of an integral probability metric. It's look for a well-behaved function that maximizes the difference in expectations. And these are the integral probability metrics. So now, I've talked about a well-behaved function in a very general sense. I need to be a little bit more explicit, like what is my well-behaved function? How do I construct it? So for the maximum mean discrepancy, I'm going to be explicit about what my well-behaved functions are. These are unit balls in something called a reproducing kernel Hilbert space. So what does that mean? Okay, here is my well-behaved function, f of x. Now my well-behaved function is going to be a sum of features of x. Okay, sum over L equals 1 to infinity, a coefficient of L times phi L of x. So phi L of x is a feature of x. And so here I've shown visually what this looks like. I've got this set of coefficients, and then I've got this set of features. And you can see that this feature dictionary is going to give me a smooth function, because as I go up my feature dictionary, my functions become less and less smooth, and their amplitudes become smaller and smaller. So if I define my function of f as a weighted sum of these features, I'm going to end up getting a smooth function, a well-behaved function. All right. Now, I've talked about f being a unit ball. What this means is that the sum of the squared coefficients that define my f, that multiply these features, have to be less than or equal to 1. So even if I've got infinitely many features in my dictionary, nonetheless, the sum of the squared features is going to be less than or equal to 1. All right. And so, what this also means is that my features here, as I go down my dictionary, not only are my amplitudes of my features getting smaller and smaller, but these coefficients are also getting smaller and smaller. So I end up getting a smooth function. Okay, so I said that my function is a sum of features, and that these features have larger amplitude when they're more smooth. However, here I've given myself a little bit of a problem, because it might be that I need infinitely many features in my dictionary, and infinity is a big number. So how do I deal with these infinite feature dictionaries? This is where the power of kernels comes in. Okay, so what are kernels? Kernels are dot products between features. So let's say I've got my feature map from my previous slide. So phi of x is my dictionary of features of x. This notation here, that the features are in little l2, this means that the sum of the squared features is finite. Okay, so even if I've got infinitely many features, the amplitudes are getting smaller and smaller. Now a kernel is a dot product between features. Okay, so if I have my feature dictionaries, a kernel is just a dot product. Think of the kernel as a measure of similarity. So if the dot product is large, that means that these features, phi x and phi of x prime, are well aligned, and the objects x and x prime are very similar. So I've got, for example, two dogs that look very much alike. If the dot product is small, then it may be that my two objects are very dissimilar. So for example, a dog and a fish. Okay, and in this case, my kernel is going to be much smaller. So a kernel is a measure of similarity between objects. Now, going back to the example of the dictionary of features in the previous slide, I actually chose this dictionary of features for a reason, which is that the dot product between those features gives me my exponentiated quadratic kernel, my Gaussian kernel, which is one of the most popular kernels in machine learning. Okay, so as long as I can express my algorithm entirely in terms of kernels, so entirely in terms of dot products between features, then I never need write down my infinite feature dictionaries. I can always instead just deal with the features in terms of their dot product, and I'm fine. So, I've introduced the kernel as a dot product between features. I've introduced the maximum mean discrepancy as an integral probability metric. It's not yet clear if I can express the MMD only in terms of dot product. So this is something we're going to have to work a little bit to do. Okay. So going back to the maximum mean discrepancy, my maximum mean discrepancy, it's an integral probability metric where my well-behaved functions are the unit balls in a reproducing kernel Hilbert space. One question I might ask is, well, how rich does my RKHS need to be for this distance to be 0 only when P and Q agree?
So we have a related question
yes,
in the chat
ask.
from Devlet.
Yep.
So he asks, instead of choosing a kernel manually, maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but he's asking, instead of choosing a kernel manually, could one learn it via learned features?
That's an excellent question, and you preempted the second half of my talk. So the answer is absolutely you can. What you'll see in the second half of the talk is that we do in fact need to learn the features when we're using the kernel as a critic for training GANs. I will give just a little bit of a preview here. So there's this, in a sense, like two different problems one might want to address. One is that I just want to test if P and Q are different. And then I would learn very discriminative features for testing that P and Q are different. The other is I might want to use MMD to train a GAN. Now, in this case, maybe I don't want the most, shall we say, rigorous features, because maybe if I learn very, very strict features, I'm not going to give very useful feedback to my student. But yeah, at a high level, absolutely one can, and indeed one must learn features to get very discriminative critics. Does that answer the question? Yeah?
I think so.
Great.
Thank you.
I should also say, please, at any time, type a question in the chat and interrupt me. I'm very happy to take questions whenever they arise. So yeah. So if one is using, for example, as the set of features, the features that arise from the exponentiated quadratic kernel, this is an infinite feature dictionary. And this means that this quantity is 0 only when P and Q agree. So this is a very, very rich feature dictionary that is 0 only when P and Q agree. So this is, in a sense, a sufficiently powerful set of features to always distinguish P from Q. There are other integral probability metrics that are also very rich. So one very popular and deservedly so class of integral probability metrics from the machine learning literature are the Wasserstein distances. So these are functions that have a bounded Lipschitz norm. So these are also integral probability metrics, and these are also sufficiently powerful to always distinguish P from Q. In the statistics literature, there's something called the energy distance. The energy distance is an instance of a maximum mean discrepancy for a particular kernel. So if you're interested in that, there's a paper that describes the link between those, but I'm not going to get further into that question here. Okay. So, the maximum mean discrepancy is an integral probability metric. I've described it in terms of an infinite feature dictionary, but ideally I want to describe it only in terms of kernels. So let's now show that that can be done. To show that this can be done, I'm going to use a trick. So the trick is that if I have the expectation under P of a function of X, okay, and you should recognize that from up here, then I can write this as the dot product of the coefficients that define F and the expected features of X. Okay, so basically, even if I've got infinitely many features, I can take my expectation inside my dot product. This isn't guaranteed for infinitely many features. For finite features, it's trivial. For infinite features, you have to be a little bit careful. But I'm going to stipulate that I have been careful and that you can take the expectation inside the dot product. All right. Now, this being the case, the MMD has an equivalent form as a difference in expected feature means. And this is true only for MMD. It's not true for Wasserstein distance. It's not true for any of the other integral probability metrics we've discussed. It's only true for the MMD. So let's see why that's the case. Here is my MMD. I'm looking for a function that maximizes the difference in expectations under P and Q, my well-behaved function. Now I'm going to use the trick that I mentioned in the previous slide. The expectation of the function is the dot product of the coefficients that define it and the expected features. So let's substitute that in here. I've got my expectation of my function. I replace that by the dot product of the expected features and the coefficients. The next step is going to make appeal to a geometric intuition. I'm going to try and find my function f with unit norm that maximizes this dot product between the coefficients and the difference in expected feature means. So let's see what that looks like geometrically. Here is the difference in expected feature means, this purple arrow here. And here is my f, and it's in the unit bowl. So the norm of f is bounded by 1. And I'm trying to find the f that maximizes this dot product. What is the f that does that? Well, is it this one? No. That one also no, right? The function that maximizes the dot product, f star, is the unit vector that points in the same direction as mu p minus mu q. So f star is mu p minus mu q divided by its norm. Substituting that in, we just get that the dot product of mu p minus mu q and the unit vector in the same direction is just the norm of the difference, okay? So what we've shown is that the MMD, specifically the MMD, can also be expressed as the norm of the difference in expected features under P and Q. Now, with this, we can compute our critic function. So let's do that. So, I showed, let's go back a couple of slides. I showed these nice smooth functions here. So now using the fact that the MMD can be written as the difference in expected feature means, I'm going to show you how to compute these functions from samples using only kernels. So I'm not going to have to write down my dictionary of infinite many features. I just have to write down some kernels. Let's do that now. Okay, let's say I've got my endpoints from P. So in this case, n equals 3, and I've got my endpoints from Q. How do I compute this nice smooth function that shows where P and Q are different? Well, let's say that I'm using Gaussian kernels, okay? I'm going to put little Gaussian bumps on my blue points and little Gaussian bumps on my red points.
We have another question in chat here. Does n equals m always, meaning the same number of points in the two distributions or samples?
So for my slides, I'm going to say yes. But of course, in practice, it needn't be the same. So I can as easily compute the MMD when n and m are different. The main thing is that what we would like is that both n and m, number of points from P and number of points from Q, should both increase if I want to ensure that the estimate of my function approaches its estimate in the infinite sample limit. So I can't just have that the number of blue points goes to infinity, but the number of red points remains at 3. I need both of them to increase. But that's the only constraint that I need.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say, for the moment, n equals m. I'm going to add all the blue points together. I'm going to add all the red points together. Blue bumps together and the red bumps together. Okay, the red kernels and the blue kernels. And what you're going to see here is a shape which has high amplitude. This blue shape has high amplitude where there's lots of blue points, and the red curve has high amplitude where there's lots of red points. Now I subtract my red curve from my blue curve, and this is up to some constant of proportionality, my witness function. So that shows me, it's positive where there are more blue points, it's negative where there are more red points. So yep.
We have another question here.
Good.
From Sergey, and he's asking, why do you need to sample from Q? You could compare Q to X directly.
Absolutely. So, in this case, I'm computing samples from P and samples from Q. And this is because in the GAN, this is my setting, right? I've got my samples of my real bedroom, I've got my samples from my fake bedroom. Now, a very interesting question is, what if I had samples on one hand and a model on the other hand? So what if I had samples which are blue and a model which was red? Then it would be interesting to think about comparing my samples to my model. One way that I could do this is, computing the expectation under my red model and the expectation under my blue samples. I could do that. However, it may well be the case that computing the expectation under my model can't be done in closed form. For example, I've got a very complicated model which I know only up to normalization. We've addressed this in another series of papers using what's called a kernel-Stein discrepancy. So we're using a Stein operator to get rid of this normalization problem. So I can give an entire talk about that as well. I'll just alert you to the fact that this theme exists for the time being.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's see now how it is that, I've shown visually how it is that I've computed my function. So now let's show using math why that was the answer. Okay, so let's remember from a couple of slides ago, my f, my witness function, is up to a constant of proportionality. The difference in features, expected features under P and Q. Okay, so these are the coefficients that define my f, and I've shown a couple of slides ago that this was the case. So just to recall that, here is my f star, right? Difference in features of P minus features of Q. Now, let's say that I've obtained samples from P. So these x's are samples from P, then mu hat, which is my empirical expected P features, is just the mean of these features at xi. Okay, this is my empirical feature mean. My f at a point V is the dot product of the coefficients that define it and the features of V, because that's the standard definition of a function in the RKHS. Now I just substitute in, up to a constant of proportionality, my expected features under P minus expected features under Q with features of V. And now we have the magic of kernels, right? Because here, expected features of P empirically are just the sum of the features of xi. I take the dot product of the feature of xi with the feature of V, and I get the kernel between xi and V. So this gives me the sum of my kernels between xi and V minus sum of the kernels between yi and V. And that's exactly what I showed visually on the previous slide. I have the sum of the kernels of xi minus the sum of the kernels of yi. I take the sum of the kernels of xi, I subtract off the sum of the kernels on yi, and that gives me my witness function. And so that's exactly what I've shown here. So, this is great because I don't need now these infinitely many coefficients that define my functions. When I compute it from samples, I need only use the kernels. So this is, I think, very handy. Now, going back to this question from earlier, if I had instead of the samples yi a model, I would compute the second expectation under my model. But here, I might run into difficulties if I don't have this expectation easily in closed form, in which case either I'd sample from my model or I'd use this Stein trick. Okay, are there any questions about that before I go on?
So there are none in chat at the moment. Maybe we'll give a few seconds, but sure. Otherwise I think you could move on a little bit.
Yep. Okay, so let's say now that I want to use my MMD as a critic, right? I want to use my MMD to tell my generator how to make better samples. So I'm going to just show this visually on a slide in one dimension. So it's a very trivial problem. Okay, here's my little student, my generator. My student is putting its points here, but I want it to put its points here. Okay, now here I've computed the MMD using the exponentiated quadratic kernel, and it's 1.8. Now let's say that my student is doing better now. My student has moved its points towards my blue. My MMD is 1.1. It's gone down, so that's good. So my teacher here using the MMD is actually helpful. As I move my red points towards my blue points, my teacher is telling me that I'm doing better. And if I look at sort of the gradient of the teacher as I move red to blue, it's going to be pointing my red points towards my blue points, and it's going to be giving useful feedback to my student or my generator. Okay, so basically, like my generator is going to, as my generator moves its points towards the target, my critic is going to be giving helpful constructive feedback and saying, "Yep, you're getting better. This is good. Like, keep going." So is this true for any choice of kernel? So there was a question earlier, which I think is a very good question. What kernel should I use? How should I learn my kernel? Let's say now that I use a very narrow kernel. Okay, it's still a valid kernel because it's still a Gaussian kernel, but it's much more narrow. Now here's my student. It's generating its points here. And let's say that my student is improving. Okay, it's moving its points towards the target. Now here is the MMD, 0.64, 0.64. So it is, actually it does get smaller, but it's a tiny, tiny decrease. It's infinitesimal. So effectively what's going on here is that my critic is unhelpful. So I've shown this visually by this little cartoon character here, which is like a bad teacher who basically yells at you, you're wrong, whatever you do, unless you get everything perfectly right. So this angry teacher is sort of like yelling, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, as my student's moving its points around. And this is not helpful feedback. So my student doesn't receive a signal that allows it to improve its points.
Thank you. So can we have another question in chat here asking whether you could show again the explicit formula for the MMD in terms of the sample?
Yep, here it is.
It's a reminder. So at the bottom
Yep.
here, right?
So this is the MMD in terms of the sample. That's right. Yep. Oh, that's the witness function. I should say, very important. The MMD can also be written in terms of kernels. In fact, if you like, I can show people that. Maybe it's helpful. Actually, let me do that.
Sure,
Since I have a way to do that, this is going to be using the magic of Zoom. I will share the iPad.
Perfect.
And I'll show you the MMD. So the screen usually takes a little while to manifest. Okay, so I'm going to actually show you the MMD squared. MMD squared. And this is also, I also express this in terms of kernels. So let's start with the difference of feature means, mu p minus mu q squared, because it's MMD squared. Now, this is a dot product, okay? So let's express this. The norm squared is the dot product of mu p minus mu q with itself, mu p minus mu q, right? Squared norm is the dot product of the thing with itself. Now let's expand this out. So I'm going to have three terms. I'm going to have mu p with itself, and then I'm going to have mu q with itself. Oops, mu q with itself. And now I'm going to have minus 2 times the dot product of mu p with mu q. Okay, so let's look at just this term here, okay? The dot product of mu p with mu q is equal to the dot product of the expected features under p, oops, with the dot product of features under q. Okay, now I can take the expectations outside the dot product, as I talked about earlier. And this gives me my expectation of the kernel between x drawn from p and y drawn from q. So is that clear to everyone? And if I compute this from samples, I'm going to get, from samples, sum over 1 on n, sum over 1 on m, I equals 1 to n, j equals 1 to m of my kernel between xi and yj. So this is my sample.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good. So yeah, and so basically like the MMD altogether is going to be expectation under P of K of X and an independent copy of X plus expectation under Q of K of Y and an independent copy of Y minus 2 E P E Q K X Y. So everything is in terms of kernels. So you can sort of think of this first term here as the average similarity of samples of P, and this is the average similarity of samples from Q, and this is the average similarity of samples from P to samples from Q. So if P and Q are the same, then all of these terms cancel and it's 0. If not, then my MMD is large.
Great, thank
So
you.
that's just the intuition. Yeah. All right, let's return to the slides. And here we go. Yeah, so the MMD itself, you can also compute from using only kernel. So that's very important. But as we've said, it may be that sometimes, if we're using a very narrow kernel, it's not so useful as a way to train a GAN. Okay, so I've talked about the integral probability metrics. I'm now going to introduce f-divergences and talk a little bit about those. Now, to do that, I'm going to approach this from a somewhat high level. Let's say that I'm comparing P and Q. I want some notion of how far apart they are. Philosophically speaking, there are two ways that I could think about this. One is to look at the difference, P minus Q, and if that's 0, then P and Q are the same. The other is to look at the ratio of P to Q. So if the ratio is 1, then P and Q are the same. So I'm using these terms very broadly. Okay, difference and ratio, I haven't been explicit yet. So integral probability metrics sort of use this notion of a distance between P and Q as the way of constructing the metric. Whereas f-divergences use the notion of the ratio of P to Q to construct the metric. Now, in particular, as we've seen, integral probability metrics look for a function from some well-behaved class of functions that maximizes the difference in expectations under P and Q. So we've talked quite a bit about that. Now, f-divergences, which we haven't talked about much yet, use the expectation of a function of the ratio of P to Q. Now, this function, what I want, for a start, is if I've got the density of P and Q, and if this ratio is 1, then f of 1 should be 0, because I want that the f divergence is 0 when P and Q are green. F is also going to be convex, and that's going to be useful for us very, very shortly. Okay, so in the integral probability metric ball, we have the Wasserstein, we have the MMD. In the f-divergence ball, we have a lot of metrics or a lot of divergences that people know and love. So the KALE is a very popular one. Oops. The Hellinger, the chi-squared, these all live in this ball. These two balls intersect at just a single divergence, which is the total variation distance. So basically, I can never write the MMD as an f-divergence. I can never write the KL as an integral probability metric. These are fundamentally different things. So integral probability metrics care about the difference of P to Q. F-divergences care about the ratio of P to Q. These are completely, different notions of divergence. And there is only one non-trivial divergence, which is both, which is total variation distance. So this is the L1 distance between P and Q. And that's the only thing that lives in the middle. Okay, so now let's spend a little time on this side, on the f-divergence side. A reason for doing this is that when GANs were introduced, f-divergences were the divergences used to train GANs. So it's worth understanding and exploring what they are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call them phi divergences. This is a sort of notational trick that I'll be using because I'm using f for another purpose as a witness function. So I can't call f divergences and f, otherwise I get notational scrambles. Okay, so let's substitute phi for f. I'm going to say that the d phi of P and Q is phi of the ratio of P to Q integral over Q. So when P and Q have densities, phi is my function. Phi of 1 is 0, of course, because I want my phi divergence to be 0 when this ratio is 1, where I've got my density of P to Q integrated over Q. So let's look at an example. A nice example is the KALE divergence, where phi of u is u log u. Now on the bottom here, I've just substituted u log u in here. And then what I do is I get q canceling here, and then I get the expectation under P of the log ratio of P to Q. So this is the KALE divergence, and the KALE divergence is a phi divergence, one of many. So is the phi divergence a helpful critic? I would argue not, and I'm by no means the first person to argue that it isn't. So here is a couple of phi divergences. There's the Jensen-Shannon distance, which is a sort of symmetric KL, where I take the sum of the KLs of P to P plus Q on 2 and Q to P plus Q on 2. or I could consider KL. And here I've got basically P and Q with disjoint support. What that means is that the densities have no overlap. Now, if the densities have no overlap, the KL is infinite and the Jensen-Shannon is log 2. And what's interesting about this is that even if I move my Q towards my P, the KL remains infinite, the Jensen-Shannon remains log 2, as long as there is no overlap. When you're training a GAN, you're training a GAN in very high dimensions. So the chance of the support of my real samples, for example, my real bedrooms, overlapping with my fake bedrooms is basically 0. Okay, this is what Arjovsky and Botu point out. So using a KALE divergence seems to be completely vacuous, right? Because if I'm really using a KALE divergence, then I've got this angry teacher here who's just yelling no at me whatever I do. So it seems that phi divergences are unhelpful critics. It seems that there is no way that a phi divergence could ever be used to train a GAN.
Do you? But one question here. Do you have a? Are you going to comment on how GANs appeared if this is the case? If they, use these to start?
Yep, very, very shortly on my next slide.
Perfect.
This is kind of crazy, right? Because I've just told you that phi divergences are useless. And then, you go online and you download GAN software. Almost always it's going to be using phi divergences. So what on earth is going on here? It's crazy, or it seems crazy. So what's actually going on? What's going on is that we're not using phi divergences in brief. What we're using is a variational approximation to the critic. So what we're doing is we're sort of taking the idea of a phi divergence and nudging it towards an integral probability metric in a way that I'm about to describe to you. Okay, and this is called a variational approximation. And the very first GAN, Ian's paper, was in fact using this variational approximation. In addition to this, what happens often is one adds something called instance noise. What that means is that I take my red and blue samples and I add a little bit of Gaussian to them, a bit of Gaussian noise. When I add Gaussian noise, suddenly I have, my support of my distributions is the entire space because the Gaussian has support, which is the entire, RD. So then by definition, I have overlap, even though the overlap might not be great. But at least the phi divergences are well defined. Now, what has been shown in a number of papers is that this instant noise amounts to adding a data-dependent gradient penalty on the variational critic. So I take this variational approximation and then I add an additional gradient to regularize it to it. So this combination of variational approximation and gradient penalty seems to be how you can take this sort of concept of a phi divergence and turn it into something helpful. Okay, so let's look at this variational approximation because this is the heart of why GANs using phi divergences actually work. So this is, I think, an incredibly important slide. And there's a couple of papers that talk about this, but I think this paper by Sebastian Novotny is the key, the clearest, I think, expression of this idea. Okay, so here is my KL. My KL is my log ratio of P to Q integrated over P. Now I'm going to lower bound this KL, okay, by the following form here, this variational form, which is minus EP of F plus 1 minus EQ of e to the minus F. So this, plus 1 minus EQ to the minus F up to some change of variables, this is the conjugate form of my phi from my phi divergence, okay, the conjugate dual form. So what is this conjugate dual form? If you haven't encountered it before, it's the slope-intercept form of my phi. So remember, my phi is convex. So for every slope, there is a unique intercept, because it's, in this case, strictly convex. What this phi star does is it says, well, give me a slope. I'm going to then take the tangent line at that slope, and I'm going to return you the negative intercept. So it's the slope-intercept form. So I'm going to substitute in this slope-intercept form of my function, and then I'm going to get a lower bound in terms of this f. So my f is now in some class of well-behaved functions. And now you should be getting flashbacks because this starts to look a little bit like an integral probability metric again, but not quite because it's not symmetric anymore. So I've got my EP of f, and I've got my EQ of, well, no longer f, but e to the minus f. And then I've got this plus 1. So you might already suspect that this might be a little bit better behaved than the KL. When is this lower bound tight? Well, it's tight if my class F, my class H, I should say, is rich enough that it contains the negative log ratio of P to Q. So the F diamond, which is the F that makes this lower bound tight, is in this case for the KL, the negative log ratio of P to Q. If P and Q are Gaussian, then this log ratio is just a straight line when P and Q are Gaussian and the means are different. So I've plotted here the function that maximizes this lower bound. This is true if the ratio is defined. Of course, if the ratio is not defined, then I'm in trouble, like if the ratio of P to Q is infinite, for example. But as long as this ratio is defined, this is what F diamond is. Okay. But if the ratio is not defined and if my class of functions is smooth, then this lower bound might well still be defined. So even if the KL is infinite, which is useless, the lower bound is still finite and still might give me helpful feedback. I'm going to just pause here for questions. Is that clear to everybody?
I'm going to give it a few seconds again in chat. There's nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, I'll continue, but if questions arise, please ask.
So conceptually, we're still thinking about, just to clarify here, we are thinking about a lower bound because does that correspond to having a less strict teacher? Is that the analogy here?
Exactly. So basically, like the KL basically tells me if my support of my P and Q are disjoint, it's a bad teacher and somebody who's going to yell at you and say you're wrong, whatever you do. If I take a lower bound, it's less strict. It's a lower bound, right? I'm going to be my student is going to be given a lower bound on the critic loss, and is going to which arguably the student's trying to minimize the lower bound. That sounds like a stupid thing to do, but actually it's not, because the upper bound is infinite and the infinite is completely unhelpful. But this lower bound is actually helpful because it's giving me useful feedback as I make my P and my Q approach each other.
Thank you.
For the Gaussian case, you can see immediately, as my means approach, this line becomes closer and closer to being a flat line, a line which is just the x-axis. So it's actually a very helpful critic in this case. Okay, the next point is that I can compute this from samples. Okay, so let's say that I've got samples from P and Q. I just replace my population expectations here, EP of F, with a sample mean. And I replace EQ of E to the minus F also with a sample mean. So, I have now an optimization problem that I can solve. All right.
One more question from the chat. Will this lower bound give useful feedback even if the distributions are not Gaussian?
I'm coming to that. Okay. So the answer is maybe, maybe not, and we're going to see why. Okay. So first of all, this is a, I'm going to call this a KALE approximate lower bound estimator, or the KALE divergence. So the KALE divergence does sound like the KL divergence, but in fact, they're very different things. Okay, so now let's say that we've got our KALE divergence, our variational lower bound. I'm going to show now what happens when I compute this with my F, right? My log ratio estimator, computed when H is an ArcHS. So this is actually what was originally done in this paper by Nguyen, Wainwright, and Jordan in IEEE Transactions on Information Theory. Okay, now, remember that my ArcHS functions are smooth functions. So I would penalize my F. I would ensure that they're smooth by penalizing the norm of this W. Okay, so this is going to give me my KALE smoothie, which is my function. Now the KALE smoothie turns out to be a helpful critic for the example that I gave earlier. So remember this example I gave earlier where the KL, right, the actual true phi divergence is just infinite, whatever I do. However, the KALE smoothie is actually helpful here. So here is my, my F, which is the variational lower bound. So obviously it's no longer a log ratio because the log ratio isn't defined here. But the KALE smoothie, which is a lower bound, is actually constructive, and it's telling me that my red points are moving towards my blue points. And this variational lower bound, where F is computed using a neural network function class, is what is used in GANs. So this is why GANs work. So they're using something that isn't isn't quite a phi divergence. It's not quite an integral probability metric either, but it's something that's sort of moving more towards an integral probability metric than a phi divergence. In particular, it's a difference in expectations, but I've added this additional non-linearity here. And in future papers, what we've shown is that the KALE metrizes weak convergence, which is to say that when Q converges weakly towards P, as is happening in this little plot here, my KALE is going to go to 0. So this is a really, with a rich enough function class. So this is a much more helpful critic than the KL if I'm using it to train a GAN. Now, you might think, well, this is great. I've got something that I can use to train a GAN. It's always good, right? However, this is not quite true. So by replacing my log ratio with something that is smooth, I can also cause myself some pathologies. So I'm going to illustrate this with the following little toy example. So in this toy example, I have two Gaussians, right? So KL is well defined here. And one of my Gaussians is getting more and more narrow. So my red Gaussian, as I move along the x-axis, is getting more and more narrow. Now, as I make my red Gaussian more and more narrow, my red and my blue are becoming less and less similar. So as I would expect, my KL should increase. So as I move along the x-axis, my KL is getting bigger and bigger because my red is getting less and less similar. Now, I would want to penalize that. If I'm training a GAN, and my GAN is creating a Gaussian which is way too narrow, I should punish it, right? I should tell my student, no, this is not a good idea. You're getting worse and worse. Now, this is happening, right? So here is my KL, my variational lower bound. And indeed, as I move up this axis, I am penalizing myself. However, because I've enforced that my ratio of P to Q is smooth, I'm not penalizing myself as much as I should be. So that means that this sort of mode collapse situation is not being penalized as much as I would wish to do. So in enforcing the smoothness of my function, I could disadvantage myself in the case where my generator, where my student, becomes too concentrated, because I'm not punishing that as much as I should be punishing that. So that's the disadvantage of using the smoothness penalty. So in a sense, I have to be a little bit careful. Like I have to penalize the smoothness of my F, because otherwise I don't have a well-defined critic. But if I penalize it too much, then I might end up having a student who is too focused on particular parts of the space and doesn't try to sort of reflect the complete richness and variety of my P. So I'll pause for questions. Is there a question about this?
There has been a question. One is, unlike, for example, the maximum mean discrepancy that we started with, but like some of the f-divergences, KALE is asymmetric. Is there a drawback to this, or is there a symmetricized version that would be preferable?
Yeah, so indeed it's asymmetric. For training again, like we've used KALE, and KALE works perfectly fine. If you really care about symmetry, then there is a variational form of the Jensen-Shannon, which is a symmetric version of KL. So, if you care about this, or if you want a symmetric divergence, use the variational form of Jensen-Shannon, which is symmetric. For training again, I don't think it particularly matters. So if you look at Sebastian's paper, they've used KL, they've used reverse KL, they've used chi-squared, they've used like a number of different measures. And having an asymmetric divergence, maybe, depending on how it is that you optimize it, it might or might not be a problem for you, but I don't think it's particularly a problem. Yeah.
Thank you. I also want to point out we're at 2 p.m. here, so some people might leave. I do want to give you a chance to get through the slides you want. However, we'll keep the talk running, and I do like that we've had a chance to interact with the other people here.
Yeah, no, so absolutely. Like the main point was the interaction, and it wasn't me like doing like a speed wrap through data. Yeah, so
so we'll keep going for a while. If you have time, Arthur, do you have a time at which you want to stop or need to stop?
Yeah, I mean, so I also don't want to shall we say impose too much on my audience. I think what I might, what I will do is just to sort of like get back to a little question that I got earlier. So the question earlier was like, what happens when you train your kernel? Like, how do you learn your kernel? So this, I just want to sort of like describe at a high level the fact that you do need to learn your kernel, and then I'll just show some examples of pictures. So first of all, like if I use MMD with a kernel just directly on my images, I don't get great images. So I need to learn my kernel. I need to train my kernel. Now, to train my kernel, if I'm using MMD as a critic for GANs, like evidently I need convolutional neural net features. Like that's unavoidable. I mean, these are the features that one uses. But then the question becomes, well, how do I train these features to get a teacher who is informative? Okay, because I want to learn these features in such a way that my teacher still gives useful feedback to my students. So the immediate thing that we tried, that everyone else tried, was, well, let's just learn the features to maximize my MMD. I want my MMD to be really large. Is that useful? Well, no. Okay. So if I learn deep features to maximize my MMD, this is what I get. I get a witness function which has really large positive amplitude on my blue points, really large negative amplitude on my red points. It's great from telling red from blue, but it's completely useless, I should say, if I want to give meaningful feedback to my student. So this is what we tried. Like back in 2016, we thought, oh, we're gonna wipe the floor with GANs. We're gonna use an MMD with trained features. It's gonna be brilliant. And we tried it, and it was hopeless. And the reason it was hopeless was that we had too strong a critic. We had a critic that was really great at telling red from blue, but really useless if we want to give feedback to our student. So actually what we need to do is we need to weaken the critic, okay? We need to tell the critic to give like a very smooth function, which isn't so good at telling red from blue, but is much more useful to my little student here, so it can move its red points towards my blue. And so this is basically what we did. And so I'm going to just give like one little animation. I want to just show this animation because I think it's a nice way to demonstrate it. So basically, here is a 2D toy example. Here are my blue target points. Here are my red points that my student is currently producing. And I want my MMD to provide a gradient, like little arrows to my red points that pull them towards my blue points. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you using an adaptation trick for my kernel, which I'm not going to describe, what these arrows look like as I evolve my kernels, so as I train my kernels. So here you can see, like at the moment, there are no arrows. Now you can see arrows developing, and these arrows are getting more and more focused on my blue points. So in the initial stages, I'm pulling points from all over the space. I've got a very weak critic, a very smooth critic. As I train my critic neural net features, they become more and more focused on the target. So you can sort of see early stage, arrows everywhere, very smooth critic. Late stage, I've trained my neural net features, so they're focused on the target. So this is basically how you use MMD to train again. You want a very weak critic at the start, and then as your student becomes more and more competent, you want your critic to become harsher and more discriminating. And so this is basically what we do. We start with a weak critic, we end with a strong critic. And if you do that, then you can use MMD to train again. If you start with a strong critic, if you start with this guy here, well, these red points over here are not going to be told anything. So my student's going to get very poor feedback about how to improve itself. So this is why we sort of have to start with a weak critic and end with a strong one. Are there questions about that? Because that's sort of the trick that we use. And incidentally, this is also the trick that the f-GAN uses. So my f-divergences, when I use this variational form, they also start with a weak critic, a very smooth f, and they end with a strong critic, a very focused f. So this trick is exactly the trick that the f-divergences use, that we use, that everyone uses.
So there's a question. Is this like refining the features as we go along?
Exactly. So remember, when you train a GAN, you alternate. You train your critic a little bit, you train your student a bit, you train your critic, you train your student, you alternate between one and the other. But you never train your critic until convergence. So I'm going to I'm going to start with a very bad critic, a very non-discriminating critic. And then, I've trained my student a bit, then I improve my critic. Then I train my student a bit, then I improve my critic, and so on. If I train my critic to convergence right at the start, I would be starting like this. And this is completely useless to my student. My student's then going to be completely stuck because it's not going to be getting good feedback. So that's why it's so important not to train your critic too much in the early stages so that it can give feedback to the student even when the student's wrong.
Thank you. So we have two more questions here, which are
Yep.
relevant to this. So one is, do you have any tips on choosing the rate at which the critics get harsher?
Yeah, that's I think a really good question. The way that we do it, we have something called a kernel inception distance, and that's sort of telling me using some basically inception network features how far my student is from my target. And what you're going to see is, as you're training, you're going to sort of see that your performance is going to start to plateau. For a given set of critic features, as I improve my student. And so basically, I would then adjust my learning rates. I should say, I've got a given learning rate for my student and my critic, and I'm learning and then my KID sort of levels off and stops improving. Then I would adjust my learning rates. Now the schedule at which I sort of alternate between my student and my critic, that's a little bit of an art form. And so you basically sort of have to play with that. The advantage of the MMD GAN is that it gives you a sort of wider range of parameters over which you can still get convergence. So that's one of our advantages. Yep.
Thank you. Another question here is, in the f-divergence case, could you start like the KALE and then anneal into the KL? Is that what's going on?
This is, I think, very much what's going on, because you're sort of, as you're training, you're allowing your f to get closer and closer to this log ratio. Bear in mind, however, that we're in a fundamentally ill-specified case here. So your neural network, your generator, your student, is never going to learn to draw every kind of bedroom that exists. So you will always be in a situation where the real world is more complicated than your neural network can dream of. That means that this ratio will never be well defined, and that sort of means that you always, you can never hit the actual KL. You always have to sort of restrict your capacity of your critic class to ensure that the critic remains well defined.
Would that mean that it's the log ratio is locally well defined, or at least close to it, but less so in other parts of the space? Is that how to think about it?
Yeah. So I mean, one can sort of think of it that way, that there will be sort of parts of the space where there are real bedrooms that exist, which your AI will not produce, which your student, I should say, should not produce. And so for these parts of the space, of course, because you're using neural net features, you can get a function that has different amounts of smoothness in different parts of the space. I mean, that's one of the advantages that you get. And so it may well be that your critic is more smooth in parts of the space where there's disjoint support, and less smooth in parts of the space where your target and your student are overlapping.
Thank you. Another question here related to this. There have been claims that GANs memorize data too much and that they don't have support in areas basically away from the data points even a little bit. How do you think about that question?
Yeah, so I think here, in a way, we're kind of being not penalized enough for this mode collapse. And this is coming back to this picture that we had here, that we're not penalizing mode collapse as much as we should be. And so that means that we might get away with mode collapse a little more than we should do. So that is a risk when we're using these variational forms.
And in this case, mode collapse refers to this situation where we memorize data points, or at least some of them.
Exactly, like you're basically saying, like, in the extreme case, what this amounts to doing, this red thing, like let's sort of take this to the extreme, right? red point, my red would just hit its peak at a single point. Now let's say that I've got samples from my blue. I would put all of my mass on a single blue point. That's the extreme case that one might approach. And in a way, like I would want to discourage that. But the variational form perhaps discourages that less than it should. There's a number of factors that go into causing mode collapse. So this is, I think, one of the factors, but there are other factors as well, like poor choice. If your critic network is perhaps not as rich as it needs to be, if your schedule of alternating the teacher and the student isn't well chosen, there's many ways in which mode collapse can occur. But I would suggest that one reason is that the KALE, the variational KALE, doesn't penalize it as much as it ought to do.
Thank you. I think we should try and wrap up in 5 minutes or so. Or do you have more slides you want to cover? Or should we keep going?
No, actually, that's actually the main one that I wanted to do. Like I wanted to sort of show this gradient penalty. Let me go to my. I have to always show my. It's not a GAN talk without lots of pictures. So here are the pictures that we got from our Neurops paper on unconditional ImageNet. So lots of pictures. Just to emphasize, we have the software that we used. This software here is for the pictures that we just showed. So this is something you can obviously, we want our results to be reproducible. So this gradient regularized MMD is something that anyone can use. I want to also do like a post-credit scene. When you've trained a GAN, like having trained the GAN, you throw your critic in the trash. And that seems crazy because like even after you've trained a GAN, unless your student is perfect, your teacher still has information about where it is that your student is going wrong. And yet you're throwing it away. And that seems mad. So we have actually just recently put up something called a generalized energy-based model, which is basically taking a GAN and then taking our nice teacher here and putting it back into the equation. So using the teacher to improve the samples further over what you get with a vanilla GAN. So this is actually, what we've shown is that all else being equal, throwing the teacher away is a bad idea. We can always do better if we keep the teacher and use the teacher's information to improve our samples than if we just throw it in the trash. So that's a paper I would encourage you to have a look at.
Very interesting. So hopefully we can have you host you here in Sweden. Maybe sometime next year you can talk about this.
I hope so. And thank you for your patience with my running over.
That's quite all right. And we have one last question from the chat that I'll ask since we still have you here. Morteza asks, are there any analyses specific to very high dimensional data spaces? As in the asymptotic setting, the behavior distributions might change. For example, pairwise distances may become irrelevant if you go high enough in dimension.
Yep. No, this is, I think, a very good question, particularly since GANs are generating samples in very high dimensional spaces. So I think this analysis, still to some extent needs to be done. For the GANs based on integral probability metrics, there's a couple of groups that have done, I think, some very interesting analysis on the relation between the, shall we say, the critic class and its richness and the class of generators to prove that you're able to get convergence. So to prove that your generator is going to eventually match your target distribution. I'm going to quickly look at who that was. Let me just stop the share. I want to give you the name. So it's the first author is, Poxos. So the, I think final author is Barnabas Poxos on the paper. And I think the first author is, I'm failing to find him, but it was a recent paper in Europe. Yeah, here we go, Upal. So there's a paper called Robust Density Estimation under Bezov IPM Losses, and this addresses the question of convergence. So I would recommend having a look at that paper, and in particular, there is, in a sense, like some notion of how much you pay as you increase your dimension, like how much worse your rates become as you increase your dimension, which I think is a very important thing to study further. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It's been a lovely time, and thank you for the great talk. I'm very happy that you were so generous with answering all of our questions.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. I like questions.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, I just want to mention to everyone that we have more AI talks coming up during the fall, so please keep a look on the website where you found Arthur's talk, and we'll make announcements as we normally do. And with that, we'll wrap up. And again, thank you to everyone who asked questions, and thank you to Arthur. We'll see you next time.
Well,
Bye for
thank
now.
you very much for inviting me.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.